Good to see you all. Good day, good evening, good afternoon, and so forth. Financial literacy is fundamental, is essential, and isn't that often talked about, except in the household of Anastasia and Ronan. There are many books about crisis, 2009 and so forth. But this book, Sabotage, is about banks. Let's say they have a front seat in a crisis, or they may be organizers of crisis. And Sabotage focuses there's a key focus on banks. There are many books about banks, about financial economics. But the book of Anastasia and Ronan focuses on one particular activity of banks, and that is sabotage, which is really interesting. This book is also different from other books about finance because of its, I would say, because of its clarity. It has a clarion call, clarity and bite, which you can see already in the abstract. Finance is crucial. Finance has a direct link to politics, to society. In shorthand, if I may, when taxes, tax evasion goes up, right-wing populism also goes up, and legitimacy of and capability of governments is undermined, which is not often talked about. I'm now doing a review of your book, Anastasia Ronan, so I'm quite excited about this talk. So a warm welcome, Anastasia, Ronan, and everybody in global studies and participants internationally. Brett, again, thanks for the great flyer. Jack Rasmus may be joining us also. And I've also recognized Jerry Cohen, Henk Overbeek. Marvelous to see you all. A warm welcome. Anastasia, please. Thanks very much for joining us, please.
Thank you very much, Jan Niederven. Thank you very much, Brett. Thank you very much to all the faces that I find dear from my not so distant academic past. I don't see Jerry Cohen, but really nice to know that he's somewhere in the audience. Yes, I see him. We just watched.
Yes, I'm here.
We were thinking about you literally last week because we watched the movie about, it was a Netflix series about Elizabeth Ginsburg, no?
Ginsburg.
I was thinking exactly, and I was thinking about your wife.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so very much thanks for this invitation and thanks for the opportunity. Partly, I also appreciate the chance because time has passed. We finished this book before the pandemic. We finished this book before my migration from academia to policy making. So I'm now no longer, I'm on leave from City University. I work now for UNCTAD in Geneva. And I guess I should add a disclaimer that, of course, I talk about our collaborative work with René and my research. So partly it might very much correspond to UNCTAD's official position, but I'm not representing an official position of a UN body. What I also wanted to say is that possibly it will be interesting to talk partly about the book, and I prepared the PowerPoint for that, but also partly about how I, and possibly René, he's very nearby, he will be ready to answer questions, see it already in the context of a post-pandemic future, but also policy-making challenges that I now encounter or experience or have a better understanding of being here with actual institutions and people who are doing policy. So with this little preamble, let me try to share my screen. Yes, Brett, I'm sharing my screen. And I will be sharing it here. Is this okay?
It's fine.
It's fine, and if I do this, it doesn't move. How do I move the slides? Like this, okay, I understand. Okay, so as I said, it's very much a co-authored and co-loved project with my husband and also partner, colleague, mentor, a very close person, Ronan Palan, who sits nearby. It's a combination of our interest, me in the financial system and specifically in the murky process of financial innovation that hadn't been actually studied until probably 2009. 2010 even. So if you wanted to do a literature review on, for example, what it means, what is financial innovation, there was actually no literature in academia, apart from some economic articles that would suggest it's like innovation generally, and therefore it's very progressive and good for you and the market. But other than that, it wasn't possible to understand conceptually and at a deeper level the political economy of financial innovation. So I took this book and invitation to write it as a chance to get into it full scale, because I had been interested in it before. Ronan came into the project as a scholar of economic thought, of evolutionary political economy, and he brought a very Weblenian perspective on the power in finance, on how finance can be understood. And hence the title. It needs to be understood as a business, and the business of business is sabotage. That's very much, you heard now, oh, you can go home and have coffee. Sabotage, though, and business is what I don't want readers to take from the book or from the cover is it's not a story about thrilling crooks, half criminals, big swinging dicks, you know, the nasty business of Wall Street or the daily routine of hedge fund traders. It exists out there. There are now plenty of literatures that you can explore, academic and popular. But the book is quite, it departs from that saying that we're not really interested in individual stories of crime, cheating, something underground and something, you know, intentionally criminal. We are interested to understand why the system has come up in the way it has and why we are now inhabiting it, and why we seem not to have any power to be without it or to be outside of it. Hence the word financialization. Let me just explain. I think it was Brett who did the cover image for your seminar. It reminded me of Salvador Dali's paintings very much. You know, really, I was so flattered. But I took this image of the book for cover. And for those who don't know the tale, it's the fairy tale of a golden goose. I didn't know. I grew up with kind of Russian Slavic folklore, so I didn't know the fairy tale. The artist who did it for the publishing house explained. So it was a goose that was bringing golden eggs all the time, and the little babushka lady who owned the goose decided to see what's inside the goose. Why do the eggs keep coming out golden? So she cut the head off, and turned out that goose no longer could produce the eggs, golden or otherwise. So that's the fable. We can talk about it in question time, but let's go to the argument. So let me cite to you 6 key findings of an investigation. Number 1 finding: the financial industry is highly conflicted and, if allowed, is likely to abuse its clients. Finding number 2: financial houses are leveraged to the hilt. Leverage means indebted. If allowed, they would use their knowledge of economy in an abusive manner. Finding number 3: the bigger financial houses have tended to shortchange the smaller ones. Finding number 4: bankers ensured that profits were flowing to them, but if left unpunished, would also ensure that their mistakes are paid for by others. Finding number 5: Financial houses use financial instruments for tax evasion and avoidance purposes. And finally, finding number 6, financial houses use investment funds, holding companies and the like to achieve great leverage, conceal ownership and create accounting opacity. It takes longer, therefore, for the regulator to appreciate the faltering state of finance. I would have loved to say that these 6 are findings of our personal investigation, that we have spent years in the industry talking to people and finding documentary evidence for all these 6 findings. But I regret, or I am amazed to say, or no longer amazed, I'm actually saying that these findings come from 1932 to 1934, United States Senate investigation into the causes of Great Depression, of the 1929 financial crash and the causes of Great Depression. They come out of a 400-page long investigation, transcripts, evidence, documents, figures, statistics, more transcripts of sometimes very personal interrogation by Senator Ferdinand Pecora of key bankers at the time as witnesses or suspects. And all 6 points are word for word taken from that particular report. And I think that the text comes from our chapter number, I think 15 in the book. So it's very much towards the end, towards the conclusion. And that's how I decided to start the conversation with you tonight, because it's really, in one way, probably it's the most shocking revelation of our monograph, of the work for the book. It's not, the surprise came not from the Gogol story of dead souls in, I think it was RBS. It didn't come from an abuse of a tax shelter through derivatives by Barclays and Deutsche Bank. It's not about cyber currency used by a Russian criminal called Sergei Mavrodi, who first fleeced basically the whole of Soviet Union through a pyramid scheme called MMM. He was put in prison. He then was let out, but then he mushroomed and thrived as a cyber currency expert in charge of a social network, another pyramid scheme, but now for developing countries. He invented his own cyber currency, and unfortunately, I think, or fortunately for him, he's claimed to have died in 2006. I don't think with such a person you actually know for sure whether he had passed away, but apparently there was a person who died on the bench in Moscow. So these are all shocks and little surprises, but honestly, we can now write a similar size monograph with new revelations that came out after we finished the research for this. But probably the shock was this, that once we opened those 400 pages of document, of historical document, and once we saw the citations and the transcripts, we just understood, wow, this is all the same. 70 or more years have passed. History, war, welfare state, collapse of the Bretton Woods, so many financial instruments, new markets, new countries, but the citations are the same. The faults are the same. The conclusions are not the same, though. The lessons that people decided to draw from the 2 crises and depressions are not the same at all. And this is what I wanted to talk to you tonight. And probably it will be interesting for you if you study politics, power, and development. So let's go bit by bit through the 6 lessons of Pecora. One is about financial industry that is highly conflicted and, if allowed, will likely abuse its clients. In any economic or financial textbook, you will get a chapter on conflict. Probably in a political science textbook, you will also get a chapter on the principal and agent problem and how it can be resolved. But really in finance today, the conflict is not about individuals or even the principal agent sort of dilemma. And it's not about individual banks or individuals within banks. Our conversations with our colleagues, friends, and those people who contributed material to the book, they all are fairly decent people. Some of them are family friends. Our children play together. They're fundamentally okay. There is nothing mean about them. So the conflict in finance is really about power. however you want to define it, whatever Foucauldian or realist approach you want to put in it, but really it's about power. This power is about inevitable asymmetry between the big and the small in the industry, where the small wants to be the big guy and the big guy ultimately wins. And the key thing is that he doesn't, or they don't necessarily win over the small ones, but fundamentally it's a size that protects you, that gives you immunity and autonomy from society and fundamentally the state. And that's our key argument. It's not just that you are screwed by the bank as a small customer. Of course you are, that's a given. But also that the only institution that is out there to deliver some protection for societal purposes, the state, the government, is also under power of bigger, murky, complex institution, be that a bank or not a bank, that is even, I would claim, powerful not only in its thriving period, but also in its collapse. Can you imagine how powerful a major financial crisis can become, even for a medium-sized economy, and how devastating the consequences of a major collapse are regionally, globally, contagiously. There is also, of course, asymmetry between the buy and the sell side within the industry. And one of our chapters in the book is called Hosticide. This is where banks go after each other. They do it for institutional memory reasons. They do it out of vengeance. They do it just for fun. It's all documented, but it is happening, and it's clearly part of now probably popular culture. You can see really good movies made about that. Something more conventional to political scientists or political economists, there is, of course, power between the regulator and the market. There is a huge asymmetry of power, and probably out of all aspects, it's probably best understood in academic terms. There are at least literatures that you could draw upon on schools of thought why there is this asymmetry. Is it just about regulatory capture, or is it something else? Is it about ideology, or is it about the class alliances and class alliance that is weaker or smaller in a particular period of time? And finally, and most controversially, and probably least resolvably, it's the power between the financial industry and society. And that's how I started a few minutes ago, saying that it seems that we are completely trapped in this particular system of, let's call it financialized system. I don't like the word, but it is being used. It's very difficult to be outside of it. It's almost impossible. And as I was preparing the lecture, the talk today, I thought, do I have a problem with the industry as such? No, actually, I decided that I don't. I don't have, I recognize and I value that financial markets or financial system does create wealth, but financial industry is a useful element in a socioeconomic and political picture. But I do have a major problem of how it got there. And why it is still there in this way. And I think that takes me to the issue of the state and how power is being used by governments to do it. Revelation number 2, financial houses are leveraged to the tilt. If allowed, they will use their knowledge of the economy in an abusive manner. You can pick up a story with pretty much any title or any word in this title, but I went with leverage. So the post-crisis banking system in the UK has an average leverage of around 25 to 1. It's not particularly safe, but it's not 150 to 1, for example. Okay, so just to give you a spectrum. There are some calls, regulatory calls from various, from particular corners of academia and civil society calling for banks to be regulated on a 100% reserve ratio or for capital requirements for banks to be 25%. And I don't think this is actually a solution. Definitely not 100% reserve banking and definitely not boring banking. An average leverage of 25 to 1 is somewhat worrying if you are unconnected, or vice versa, if you're too connected and you don't know how, as happened with, for example, Lehman Brothers. It actually wasn't particularly exposed. It wasn't a globally significant bank. It wasn't a big bank at all. But it did bring the system down because of the connections and because of the leveraged connections and most importantly, opaque connections and connectivity. And there are still lawyers in London and New York fighting each other over who belongs to whom, or over which contract is payable to what extent. In the US, non-financial firms have been borrowing more since the crisis, while the authorities have recently actually relaxed the rule of leverage in the banking system. That was under Trump as we were finishing the book. So I needed to double check, but I don't think Biden has tightened this particular regulation. In parallel, something called the shadow banking system have actually expanded since the crisis, although many people would say that the crisis in 2007 actually started in the shadow banking system. It was very much a shadow banking system crisis. It wasn't a normal financial crisis, which is why it took more than a year for regulators to understand what's going on. So that particular shadow banking system has expanded more globally since 2009, and although a large part of it is accounted by China, it's still quite a worrying development, partly because those non-bank institutions that inhabit that system are not only regulated, but often they're not seen. The question, of course, socio-political question is who pays when the thing goes down? It is being played out on the Financial Times pages every morning as a large property developer in China is going down. Question is who pays? It's one of those examples. It could be, of course, a very Chinese matter, but it does have ultimately repercussions for how we understand global connectivity, because investors do get hurt now, investors in global markets. Lesson number 3, the bigger financial houses have tended to shortchange the smaller ones. And of course, it applies to all industries, not just finance. And I'm really sorry for the blurry quality of this particular stolen graph from, it appeared on my linked feed some years ago, and I immediately saved it because I understood this is very important. The actual source is Federal Reserve, but I wasn't able to find the original page, although I looked several times. The graph shows how 37 American banks over several decades, and if I make it smaller, sorry, if I do make it smaller, probably it will be clear, my students loved it, how 37 American banks gradually, through absorbing each other and eating each other alive, became 4. So now we have Citigroup, Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. This is the American banking system. And there are, of course, new financial intermediaries, but already it was, I think, in the 60s and 70s, you had quite a competitive industry populated by 37 already big banks, but there were 37. There was choice, there was variety. Now you can see how they were evolving, how they grouped each other and how they ate each other and swallowed. They became 4. There is a reason why they become 4, because it's, they will tell you it's economies of scale. They will tell you it allows us to deliver associated benefits to society better. JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon, I think it was about 2008, when really he was on their tag on all major TV screens, they published a little story, or maybe it was Goldman, but no, I think it was JP Morgan, how they helped a particular guy in a village to buy a boat, and how that guy gets his boat and goes to the ocean to fish, and how this thriving business of a small fisherman is helping the village with income and trade. And it was such a beautiful fairy tale. And another fairy tale actually starts our book, and it's not about JP Morgan in this case, it's about Goldman Sachs. It's about how consultants and traders from Goldman Sachs were selling complex derivatives to a camel trader in the, I think it was one of the sub-Saharan deserts. Yemen, it was Libya, of course it was Libya. It cost Libya all its savings in sovereign wealth fund. And the views of the camels are not recorded in history, but maybe they signed a contract, and I wouldn't be surprised. Lesson number 4, bankers ensured that profits were flowing to them, but if left unpunished, would also ensure that their mistakes are paid for by others. Academics like those who are sitting on the other side of the screen long developed a term for this. It's called socialization of risks. So you make your private profits when things are good, but you socialize your costs. You spread the costs when times get harder. On this particular slide, you see an image from from a particular report of New York Attorney General Cuomo. I think it's Andrew Cuomo now, and he just resigned. But it's an interesting chart of the recipients of 2008 bonus and the TARP money. So in brackets here, you see not just profits, but losses. You can see that the biggest losses for that particular year was made by Citigroup, Merrill Lynch, and Wells Fargo. You can see the bonuses that they paid, and we can leave it aside, the bonuses and what they do with them. But you also see the recipients of TARP money. That means governmental support to failing institutions, to all failing banks. And you can see that the failing Citigroup got quite a handy sum of $45 billion US. It's the largest sum in this particular table, along with Bank of America. Whereas Wells Fargo also got a 25 billion package to save its failing institution. Wells Fargo actually does feature in our book because even in 2015, there were I think they created extra 1.5 million customers, fake customers, dummy customers. They didn't exist. They just duplicated the accounts, the debit cards, all the documents, because the employees were getting bonuses for that, and it was advantageous to expand the book. So they invested a lot of labor and effort into duplicating dummy, non-existent clients. It was found out, and they paid a huge fine, but they still exist. And they were one of the largest recipients of this public money that was designated probably for something else, but was used to save failing banks. Lesson number 4, financial houses use financial instruments for tax evasion and avoidance purposes. Well, what can I say? Yes, they do. You can open FT, and now what is the latest leak? It's not Panama Papers, it's called Pandora Papers, and you can see lots of techniques, or rather lots of names of individuals who are using financial techniques for tax avoidance and evasion. But to be honest, this is again not the story for us in the book. And the reason I put Blythe Masters here, the picture, you can see the photo of a lady in a white shirt. It's Blythe Masters. She invented the CDO for JP Morgan. History has it that she actually wasn't the first to come up with the idea. The idea was born in a different bank at a slightly earlier time, but she had the team to operationalize it and to embed it in the market with a vision. And we just had a family conversation the other day with our stepson, who is now, in corporate world, and he was giving us an example of a corporate thinking for a major business in America, a startup, essentially a startup. And it's only in the beginning, but what do you think? Who do you think are the first people to be invited into the room? And the business is very specific. It's to do with the services sector and leisure. It's nothing to do with manufacturing or in fact banking. It's a non-banking business. But the first people to be invited in the room are tax lawyers. And they sit there for hours, and they still haven't come up with a corporate structure to name this business, or the corporate structures that would serve the purpose of this non-bank business. There are other lawyers as well, but who is not there are entrepreneurs or one bank or anything very specific to do with this particular exercise. The longest time is spent on tax planning before the enterprise starts. We also have it on record, confidential record, when we were doing interviews in New York from major financial lawyers who are serving big deals for securitization purposes, various types of securitization. And they were telling us the longest time, and you have to plan 6 months at least in advance, are about a tax structure for a financial instrument. If you want to launch a securitization program or a new product, it's fundamental. Without it, nothing starts. Whether it's tax evasion and avoidance and for what purpose, we can pick it up in discussion, but just to make you aware that this is fundamental to business. Without it, nothing works. And Ronan is next to me, he will tell you more if necessary, but really it's not about, finance is nothing with those tax lawyers being present in the room, or tax advisors or consultants who are channeled to Libya to sell products to camels. This is also about socialization of profits, some boring data from Europe. The 20 biggest European banks posted profits of at least 18 billion in global tax havens in 2016. Collectively, these institutions made 5 billion in profits in Luxembourg, which is more than they made in the UK, Sweden, and Germany combined. Just statistics, it's in the room, gives you an understanding. So apparently all European banks that particular year were active, very active in Luxembourg, and not as active in the very financialized system of UK, quite financialized system of Sweden, and the corporate system of Germany. Country by country data suggests that European banks didn't pay a single euro in tax on 383 million euro in profits made in tax havens in 2015. This, mind you, is what we're talking 7 years, 8 years after the start of the crisis, 8 years after the after austerity programs that were launched as a political solution to the crisis made the issue of tax evasion and avoidance a social concern, a political. It brought it into light. It became suddenly it became a public and much discussed issue. It wasn't like this before. Probably with this picture, I need Ronan next to me, but lesson number 6, financial houses use investment funds, holding companies, and the like to achieve great leverage, conceal ownership, and create accounting opacity. So what you see here on this little graph, it's not 2 parachutes, it's not a drawing of our son, he's much more talented. It's not nothing to do with, you know, skincare or makeup or female lingerie. This is a corporate map of a major asset holder in the world. If I actually wanted to, let me try to do it. Yes, if I wanted to enlarge this, you will see that the little black dots are many. There are thousands of them surrounding this. They look like little hedgehogs. There are 2, the red ones are the holding companies, everything else around it are little corporate entities. They all belong, they all represent this asset holder in the world in a particular jurisdiction. It has been recorded, so, yes, but let's say it's a major asset holder. It's still very, very powerful, and we all know it. So the distribution here is not geographical at all. It's very functional. Every little dot represents a purpose, why it was set up. Not all of them are set up for tax purposes. Some of them there are really for logistics or financial planning, but it just shows you that for example, with the current Biden initiative recently agreed globally on the minimum corporate tax in the world, how are they going to tax that? So this is, yeah, I'm showing you the big circle with literally there are thousands of these things. They also morph and they multiply. Each one of them is a face of this company to a particular jurisdiction. Some of them are many in this jurisdiction. They each have different names. And the only kind of political conclusion from CorpLink research that is being done at City University, it is being funded by European Commission, is that, to be honest, there is no such thing as a multinational corporation. You get these black dots. They all are particles of these corporations, but altogether it doesn't add up to anything. There is no such thing as a multinational asset holder in this particular case, what we're talking about. Now, how do I get out of what I just did? Yeah, sorry. So I'm very soon concluding with all this. To come back to kind of the message of the book, again, it's not a thrilling story of individual greed, criminal behavior, or malice, or cheating in the system. It's about how we understand finance. we're very used to reading or hearing that, well, finance is such a special industry. It requires, special talent. It's about time and promise, and there are risks. And of course, only finance can calculate the risks and diversify them enough. And that's why they reap these huge profits. And it is very, very competitive and, stuff like that. Yeah, partly it's all true, but really without this sabotage, it doesn't work. And sabotage you can see the quote from Veblen, it's really various maneuvers of delay, obstruction, friction, defeat, employed by workmen initially to enforce their claims or by employers to defeat their employees or the competitive business concerns to get the better of the business rivals to secure their own advantage. The only purpose of sabotage is to control the market and whoever wants to control the market, be that a civil society group or the state, basically to sabotage the public interest. Sabotage is not driven by malign concern, spite, or vengeance as such, but is intended to ensure the profitability of financial trading in otherwise efficient markets. So to our surprise, when we were finishing the draft, we understood that we agree that the efficient markets actually work. Theoretically, in abstraction, in real business, nobody wants to operate in any competitive market. If business hears about new competition relaxation, that there will be newcomers into the market, they will get a panic attack, because this is clearly not what they want. What they want is to be a monopoly, well, maybe an oligopoly, but really ideally a monopoly, with a very tangible power cloud over whoever is in power. And also, as I think it was Jerry in one of his articles who said that power is not just about who does what, or not even the structural power in its early interpretation in political economy. Power is also about the process. So as long as you're doing this, as long as you keep inventing, as long as you keep relying and inventing new financial techniques, products, the options to extend the credit system as such, you are endowed with enormous power in finance, and that power now belongs not just to banks, but also to shadow financial institutions who continue to be unregulated. I think it's one of my last slides to basically return to from what I started, my personal interest in the story. What did I learn about financial innovation? Conventionally, you will learn that financial innovation is about invention of new products and techniques to deliver credit. It's something that reduces costs, risks, and provides an improved product efficiency and instrument that better satisfies my demand within the financial system. And as a customer of a financial system, I can tell you it's very annoying not to have speedy financial product or service delivered to you. It's really not good. Boring banking is not good. Women were not that particularly represented in the nice banking of the 1950s, for example. So the first citation on this slide comes from a typical, quite mainstream financial text. A sociologist called Simon Polillo defined financial innovation very simply as regulatory arbitrage. It directly concerns the picture of that huge asset manager that I showed you, because that's the pictorial representation of what arbitrage is like. Not all of it is purely financial. Some of it is there for legal reasons and planning reasons and logistical reasons. But regulatory arbitrage is what drives financial innovation. Another quote from a banker who spoke in France just as, I think, weeks after Lehman collapsed. And he was really having fun. He turned out to be a post-Keynesian. He loved all the left-wing and progressive economic texts. He was very well equipped on economic history. And we asked him, are you worried about what will come? Are you worried about new regulation? Are you worried about being in the regulatory spotlight? And he said, no, because whatever they come up with, I have a brilliant team of lawyers, tax accountants, more accountants and more lawyers that will very quickly set up a structure or a technique that could avoid any new regulation that comes our way. He was absolutely confident, and last time I checked, the bank was thriving. So I believe that academic training in Keynesian economics and practical handling of financial products really delivers good banking product for the banker himself. How we define financial innovation here is that it has become a technique for sabotaging the public welfare and the government. And the sobering lesson is not just that it was precisely this that happened in the 1920s, was addressed in the 1930s, quite in a complex and systemic way by very clever and radically thinking people at the heart of American capitalism. It was then, the solution was then institutionalized in 1944-45 well, partly in the New Deal, but partly in new Bretton Woods institutions. And it sort of delivered a relatively workable, if somewhat boring, financial system for at least 25 years. Post-COVID, and now I draw a little bit on my short experience here in Geneva with UNCTAD, it seems that we are in an opportunity to recreate a Bretton Woods system for the 21st century, really. Too many parallels have coincided. We are, after a major crisis, we are all in it together. The crisis is considered to be very non-economic and very exogenous. It has slowed the world down considerably, and very unorthodox and radical policy measures were employed to solve the crisis. What is interesting, of course, is that geopolitically, back then, 70 years ago, US leadership was sufficient and necessary and enough to build the system. Today, it's not. It's necessary, but it's insufficient. There is a clear call for more multilateral cooperation, better coordination, and a more inclusive system of governance, which is not being delivered. And the greatest danger of very very quick post-COVID recovery is that policymakers and decision makers would want to recover to pre-COVID times, to pre-COVID normality. And just like in 2010, they wanted to return back to the levels of 2007, which was, of course, the peak of the bubble. So this natural, probably emotional longing to return to pre-crisis time is now probably the biggest danger to recovery itself. Let's not miss this chance now. We have missed it back in 2009. We haven't regulated the financial system fully. We have not addressed the risks. We have made the banks better. We have made societies pay for private mistakes and private profits. We have not made the global system fairer at all. So maybe let's use the post-COVID space to not to make those mistakes again, and to actually restore multilateralism to its original meaning, to share some of the wealth, to make the financial and corporate elites more accountable, and to re-emerge the state as an economic institution, not as a marginal regulator who is there to save banks when they're falling only, but actually as a part of a now new Green Deal solution for societies and, dare I say it, capitalism. So I think that's it. I missed this particular slide, but I think I will now stop sharing. I will be very happy to address your questions, and thank you for being so attentive and silent. I know you're all on mute, so you're very good students.
Oh, Anastasia, thank you so much. It is it's very intriguing to listen to all this, and I'm sure many people have questions. There are already some notes in the chat. Please, who wants to step in and make comments? Please, Nelson.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I have a question about this. and partly about some of your previous work, which I haven't read. I think you have a 2007 book. I'm interested in the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98. And in that moment, Joseph Stiglitz makes the argument in favor of capital control, international capital controls, which I guess is a step toward a renewal of Bretton Woods. And he is countered by the IMF and by people like Robert Rubin, who make the argument that when you talk about capital controls, especially in places like Russia or East Asia, Thailand, Korea, you're really talking about crony capitalism. He uses the Rubin is the and people like him use that and make the argument that that will corruption, etc. And I wonder what I'd like to know your point of view about some of that. And secondly, you've also talked about the Minsky moment, and could you link that the Minsky's ideas to this this argument you're making about financial sabotage as well?
Okay, thank you. Shall we take it one by one, Jan, or how?
Yes, for as long as there is no crowd control necessary, please respond to this one, Anastasia.
Okay, so Nelson, capital controls. Yes, and of course the argument back then was the only country that introduced capital controls but didn't use IMF money was Malaysia, and but the policy prescription it implemented was very similar to a standard IMF program. I personally, in my research, I don't find that capital controls deliver. I mean, they are punitive measure. They're very much in the power of recipient governments, but I don't think they are a solution to making finance productive, responsible, accountable, green, if you want, engaged with society. It's they were part of the system back in the 50s and 60s, but the system was simpler. It was much more exclusionary, basically. Not everybody could bank. It was slower, more expensive. It's completely inappropriate for 21st century digital, mobile, whatever, interconnected world. So in that respect, and also I can give you two examples when capital controls introduced by the states themselves became completely devastating for the economies and societies and normal people who lived there. That's Argentina 2001 and Cyprus 2014. The controls were implemented by the banks themselves. So to what extent, for example, capital controls in Cyprus were very much targeting a particular fraction of capital, that's Russian offshore capital, and they were punitive measured by the European Union. Did Cyprus cease being de facto financial center for Russian money? No, it hasn't. It gave for 2 years, who replaced Cyprus in Russian statistics as a source of recycling was Bermuda and the Bahamas. But now Cyprus is back. So the financial center of Russia is not in Moscow, it's in, what is it, Nicosia? It's in Cyprus. Limassol, yeah, so, and everywhere. They have everything Russian, they have Russian radio, they have Russian churches, they have Russian shops, they have Russian, but it's a whole infrastructure that comes with it. And it's not only, I reiterate, it's not set up there for criminal purposes. Russians use these centers not to so much to kind of, I'm not saying cheat, but they use it to conceal ownership, not to tax evade, they are quite happy to pay tax because in Russian the official tax is quite low, but they are often scared of, if you want, hosticide by your own partners in the industry, some competing oligarchs, or maybe they're hiding ownership from the state itself. Argentina is a completely different story, but again, those controls that were introduced as a very harsh political measure delivered poverty and hardship to local societies, and they didn't particularly. I think this hedge funds that is pursuing Argentina didn't. So no, I think it's a political instrument on the arsenal of policymakers I guess it could be a threat by developing countries or emerging markets who are negotiating. But to be honest, in terms of actual delivery of that type of capital that is needed for development, I don't think I would agree that it's the one that delivers. And I know that some institutions and people disagree with me, and capital controls are suggested as part of the solution, partly because they take foreign capital as the only source of speculation. Again, yes, partly it's true, but partly it's not true. It varies region by region. Minsky, how it works with sabotage. Minsky was in fact a Veblenian. He's an offspring of the same school of thought from Schumpeter, Veblen, Keynes, Minsky. So they share the same, and I think, well, when Minsky was writing, he had to be very careful. He was writing in the late 70s, 80s American capitalism. He didn't even mention the word labor in his text, not to be called socialist. He very specifically wrote about finance because it was safe for his academic career. So also that was probably, I'm guessing now, I know about labor from his students and colleagues. About sabotage I didn't discuss, but I'm guessing this would be a risk factor for somebody who came from a Menshevik family in Belarus and wrote quite critical texts about academic capitalism. But what does unite the two, if you want, models or frameworks, is that Minsky, of course, was the one who immortalized the notion of Ponzi finance, and that in the name of Carlo Ponzi. Only he did it, Carlo Ponzi was a crook, good one. Minsky has nothing about cheating, malice, or human factor, or individual misdeeds. For him, it's a heuristic tool to describe a state of the system. Similarly for us, we use sabotage not as a story about individuals, wolves of Wall Street, or Michael Douglas and his suspenders, although I do use some figures who innovated particular instruments, but it's not really about them. It's about how they are embedded and digested and institutionalized in the system widely. So I would say this is the biggest parallel between the two schools of thought.
Please, I see questions in the chat from David about the Chinese bubble, and from Christian, although I'm not sure Christian has audience. David, do you want to comment?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Anastasia. Absolutely wonderful talk. I kind of wonder if you are seen as threatening by the banks and some of these other folks who are out there.
No, whistleblowers are threatening. Academics have the luxury of writing whatever they want.
And not being threatening, I guess, too. Although Nelson may have some other comments on that one. I'm wondering how the current Chinese bubble might be related to today's banking system, and also what your hunches are about where banking is going in the next 5 years or so.
Well, Chinese bubble is somewhat an easier question. We don't know. And whoever will be now writing articles about a Chinese Minsky moment or a collapse of this, what I learned, and I'm now saying it as a person who spoke to bankers, investors who deal with China, sometimes are from the region, and this is their perspective. They are worried. They are watching China, expect stress, potential risk. But to be honest, taking it all out into one story, I could say they don't even know which questions to ask. So the current question about Evergrande is usually, does the state bail it out completely, and when does they stop?
Right.
They kind of understand that this is the largest and the last essentially fixed guarantee for investors. They've been used to that. They've been used to state support, pretty much not just in China, in everywhere. And this is a quote from one of the investors in the region. He said, "Nobody in the world, no country has got so rich so quickly in history. We don't know. This is an unknown beast. So the way it can go maybe one of those articles or commentaries or books that have been written on China will hit it. But it's like, remember there was a competition between a parrot in terms of Keynes, I think, and the efficient market hypothesis, who picks the best shares. The people, it was journalists in New York Times office who threw darts into stocks, and those very clever professors who chose them. There was no difference in profits made by the journalists who threw darts and the clever Nobel Prize winners professors. So it could be that one of the projections about future Chinese bubble collapse will actually be true. But to be honest, the honest answer is that we don't know, and it's too early. We are not in the right moment of history to know that. We need to be prepared. In fact, before COVID, one theory in financial systemic risk conversation was that, of course, there will be a crisis. Of course, it will be complex. Most likely, it will come from China, which in fact it did. It just came in the form of pandemic or in the form of virus, not a financial collapse, not yet. So that it doesn't answer your question, but that's an honest answer.
But it's a reasonable answer, Anastasia. And of course, I've lived in Japan for a long time, and the reference to the Japanese bubble is one that kind of comes up here too. Exactly.
What was the second question, David?
What was my second question?
To banks. Yeah. So, studying the power of the system, I think now they already are becoming. It's very fashionable now to become a green bank. It's very fashionable to say that you're providing public utility, which to an extent they do. So my guess, it's a projection that some of the bigger banks and those who are more foresightful and it's not just a spin exercise, they're going to become closer and closer to the state on which they have come to rely so closely, saying that we are now societal providers. We are no longer banks. We provide all these things to society. There is a little kind of murky question of shareholder value and what they do with the shareholders and how they. But it can be a trend can emerge that banks, of all financial institutions, banks will be the first to claim that we are ethical, we don't exploit these, we don't sell products to camels. We are liquidity providers for society, and this is, other institutions would not be doing that. The banks will be there.
Wow.
Anastasia, David, thanks. Anastasia, I see Abdul's question in the chat. How do institutions like IMF and World Bank, how do they relate to the sabotage? Are they somehow part of it, or are they outsiders? I'm not sure Abdul has audio at the moment. Not sure about Christian either. Please, Anastasia.
Yeah, I think you're partly answering your own question, Abdul, in the second part of your question, because it depends on time. Just as banks now are becoming very nice and fluffy and white and kind of very cuddly, back then, you're talking about late 70s, early 90s, that was a different industry. There was absolutely no accountability, and it was actually fashionable to be aggressive, unaccountable. This is how you move. In fact, that's how J.P. Morgan invented CDO, according to a popular memoir. J.P. Morgan, at the time, we're talking about 1993, 1994, by its own employees was considered to be too stuffy. It's a dinosaur. It's very cultured, whilst those dirty guys who are much more aggressive, who are much more decisive, Lehman, Deutsche, Bear Stearns, they're ahead, they're registering super profits. So now we need to do something to outperform them. And that's how CDO was in fact invented. Again, it wasn't designed as an instrument of sabotage. There was a vision behind to help carry the bank into the 21st century. Little detail, CDO is of course by its nature an insurance product. That's how it's part of insurance. That's why they pulled AIG down with them. But they spent lots of money and months and human capital on lobbying for CDO to be considered and named a derivative so that insurance regulations don't apply to it. So that's kind of, if you want, the intention to sabotage whoever will be there eventually was in the design. They didn't want to work with it as what it was, the insurance product. They sold, used, and kind of spread it as a derivative. But to be fair, it wasn't JP Morgan who went down. It was when the CDO technique was applied to subprime mortgages, then the system started to crumble. So I need to say honestly, the relationship with the IMF and the World Bank. So I think they're now, well, they're complex institutions, and the people who work for them can be of a variety of political persuasions and training. They're definitely not stupid, and they're very much aware of the time. But there is an overall bias still in the system towards private sources of finance. There's still a belief that finance delivers when it sees profitable projects, and that's how it pays off better. And that's why it's such a problem. For example, we're launching our report on climate adaptation literally in 10 days, in 2 weeks. And one of the revelations of observations of research and data is that climate adaptation as an unprofitable, as a non-profit generating set of processes and work doesn't attract private money so much. It does need to rely on public sources of funding, on public banks, on multilateral banks. And I think it will take the IMF and the World Bank some time to come to that conclusion. So they may not be now aggressively defending private interests of JP Morgan simply because of evidence and history, but there is still a systemic bias towards prioritizing private delivery of capital.
Please, Jerry, would you come in? Audio. Put your audio on, Jerry.
You're muted. Unmute yourself.
Unmute, Jerry.
Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. I was hitting the wrong button. Anastasia, thank you so much for a very stimulating talk. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I have a couple of questions. One, I wrote down something from one of your last slides where you said, financial innovation is a technique for sabotaging the public welfare and the government. Now, I want to ask a simple question. Is that the intention of financial innovation in your mind, or is it a side effect? If it's a side effect, then that implies that there may be other consequences as well. And there may be a balancing of benefits and costs in financial innovation. I'd be curious to know if you could expand on that a bit. The other has to do with Bretton Woods, my second question. Much of the literature on Bretton Woods suggests that there were two principal reasons. I'm thinking of Erica Leiner among others. There were two principal reasons why Bretton Woods was successful in achieving a blueprint for the post-war period. One having to do with the concentration of power at the state level. It was basically, there were two dominant powers at that time in finance, the United States and to a lesser extent Britain. And secondly, that there was a consensus, an ideational consensus on what the problem was and problems were and what could be done about them. I was listening to your talk, which frankly, much of it is pretty depressing from a public welfare point of view. And then suddenly at the end, you turned very much more optimistic about the possibility of a new Bretton Woods. I don't see either of those conditions that made Bretton Woods successful. I don't see the concentration of power. I don't see the ideational consensus. What leads you to be more optimistic about the possibility?
Fantastic question, Jerry. Thank you. Your hand is still up. You might want to switch it off.
Thanks.
On your first question, whether sabotage is a consequence or not, I'm not sure how I would have answered it before we finished the book, but now I will say it's from the initial design, that every instrument being set up, every technique being invented, not an ATM machine necessarily, but a process, in your language, a process of extending credit and getting money out of credit is by design a sabotage, or a technique of sabotage, mostly because it involves private initiative. It needs public protection to be workable. It needs authorization into the market. It needs licenses. It needs contracts. It needs to be recognized as an instrument or as a technique. They even want to regulate, or they do regulate cryptocurrencies now, which is kind of the epitome of private institutional instrument and product innovation and spatial innovation in some way. So yes, that doesn't mean that there are no side effects that were not built into the design. There will be, they inevitably are, but the calculation is that either we are okay to assume those little risks that we have already calculated, because they do calculate the risks, or this is important enough for us to apply or to be saved if it all goes down. So I will think more about this answer later on, not now, but I think, interestingly, although malice is not the design, sabotage is not malicious by design, financial innovation by design has arbitrage and sabotaging of public transparency and welfare and interest by design, because it's made by the private sector. I simply don't see how they can be not in conflict. The public, the public is about sharing, private is about thing. Why am I optimistic about Bretton Woods, the two conditions? I agree with you on two conditions. Of course, I probably am a little bit more optimistic on the ideational consensus. I agree that there is no concentration of power, there is no coherence of vision for global governance, there is a geopolitical, let's call it complexity. There is a risk also, the reason I'm so fluent in jargon is that I finished an op-ed about UNCTAD's TDR using Susan Strange. Remember her key non-decisions and their consequences in casino capitalism. So there is a major risk of these non-decisions now prevailing in post-COVID international relations. Somebody would not agree to waive the rights to vaccine. Somebody would not agree to a particular expansion of credit. Somebody would not agree to share. They would not send money to a country or a group of countries. It's very easy not to join even Biden's quite radical proposals for new multilateralism. The easiest thing is not to do it. But there will be major systemic and political consequences to these non-decisions. At the same time, ideationally, I think I'm not sure we're as yet in Adolf Berle's circle of New Deal brain trust, Roosevelt. You know, when they all were together, really designing systems are not new, need to be. But when I the way major financial regulators, for example, even talking, let's say in 2002, what they were publishing and saying, and what they say now, there is clearly a shift towards a different set of ideas.
I'm sorry, toward what?
Towards a different set of ideas, towards an understanding that, hey, you know, this liberal thing is bankrupt. And I have worked back then. It's very good on pages. That doesn't deliver. What it delivered to us is a very fragile world built on. I think, as I was preparing, J.P. Morgan is now saying it's atrocious and threatening that the super wealthy have become even more wealthy, and there is always poverty in the world. His little fisherman guy with a boat wasn't enough to save the world. I expect more stories about fishermen and boats, and Goldman, of course, now has a proper bank. It's called Marcus in the UK. They serve customers.
Please, Marcus. Later, Jerry, if you have a further comment, but we go Marcus now, please.
Thank you so much. There was a fascinating talk. I'm so excited to hear about the opportunity of post-COVID juncture. As a sociologist of social change, I'm particularly interested in exactly that. But yet, given the asymmetry of power that you have also described, what would prevent then actually those financial banks and other actors to spend on lobbying, whatever it is needed to undermine any of the regulatory attempts in the major countries at the global level? How could enough power be put together to push governments to implement a new regulatory framework? Where is civil society showing sufficient awareness, concern, and articulated demands to push the governments and political parties in that direction? Is there enough social movement intelligence and organizational capacity to coalesce around some kind of a vision, perhaps similar to we have just witnessed with the current referendum on the big housing industry, expropriations in Germany, big petition to expropriate large housing holding companies. Is there something on the horizon? Is perhaps UNCTAD producing the blueprint, the vision around which movements could coalesce? In other words, how would a trajectory towards a new regulatory framework look like? How would you imagine the road ahead in such a scenario, into such a direction? And how, perhaps, if I may add half a question more, how could different disciplines contribute in such an endeavor?
Okay, gosh. Okay, an attempt to answer. Two very simple ideas. One is this thing called democracy that wasn't invented in my part of the world, kind of more like yours. It's a powerful thing. One example is what I mentioned in the talk, is the issue of tax avoidance and evasion of offshore financial centers. The person who actually put it on a public radar back in 2003, nobody was interested, but he published a book called The Offshore World in 2003, and he opened at least an academic conversation about a phenomenon. Crisis after crisis, this conversation was then picked up partly by civil society, but what was most moving in mobilizing it to, let me draw, it's a very simplistic kind of coincidence, but in 2021, I think it was last week, that major countries signed the Biden's proposal for a minimal corporate tax. Of course, there are questions of how it will be implemented, who they're going to tax of those little entities that I presented to you, what are the thresholds, how individual countries lobby for their interest. Ireland decided that, please leave us this, why there is a limit on the size of capital. So there are technicalities, but it was very much, I think, partly, and in large part, it was the result of the unfair solution to the 2007 crisis, when the rich got richer and the average poor middle class got poorer through, not necessarily through immediate effect, but through austerity. And of this contrast between the corporate and individual elites using the wonderful system, the topography of globalization, as the societies were paying the price. It was a movement. You could see civil society getting more and more powerful, confident, also professional. So out of the movement, you now get not just a movement, you get actually organizations or NGOs who are producing reports and indices and indicators that the industry is scared of. The financial secrecy index, for example, is not what they love. Nobody wants to be, in the top layer of the table. And it's very much a result of the movement. So as a sociologist, it's a fascinating thing. Question is who they go after next. So now the enablers are under radar, the accounting firms, and I'm waiting for the moment when lawyers will be investigated, because of course it's not just the accountants, it's the lawyers. Also an interesting story, and this is just a side comment, what happened to the reform of the credit rating agencies? I didn't write on it, but they were the first to be understood as abusers of the system back then, or as a victim, you know, whatever you want to say, but they were clearly immediately under the radar in 2009. And though they seem to have escaped completely unscathed by the reform. I could see the technical reasons. You need competence, you need standards. The private industry has its own commissions and standards and bodies, and this is how they thrived. And the public doesn't. The public has some interest in the bank because everybody uses the bank, but not everybody uses the credit rating agency in their daily life. I could see why it wasn't an immediately carryable political issue, but understanding it in a complex but simple way, how it actually touches you, that those credit agencies affect how you own your house, is a very simple delivery message to those who vote. On UNCTAD, yes, it's called the Green New Deal. It was published in 2019 in the annual TDR report that is the product of my department now. And it's very much a blueprint of an economic program that can be seen as an adapted Bretton Woods system for the 21st century that has fairness, inclusion, sustainable growth, and green sustainable growth, and climate change at the core of its agenda. Wherever you look in this agenda, it assigns much more role to society and the state vis-a-vis the private sector and finance and corporations. So yeah, I wouldn't say there is a lack of ideas. As I said to Jerry, I'm not even saying that there is a lack of consensus. No, I think those are doable things. They exist and they are executable. Politically, multilateralism, I see part of your side question was, can multilateralism also be a smokescreen? It has been a smokescreen for several decades. So yes, it can be. Question is, or task is, let's take the screen away and let's work with the system that we have and make it better.
Anastasia, linking up to this, if in your opening statement, in your presentation, you say multilateralism is what is necessary to move forward, and we deal with the intermediary institutions of multilateralism, such as IMF and World Bank, and you note that these still have a bias towards private financial institutions, while actually shadow banks play an enormous role. How do you rhyme these things? What is the new balance that is necessary to move forward in this setting, which apparently you do have in mind, because you say UNCTAD multilateralism is the way forward. How is it the way forward?
Well, multilateralism is multi-level. It's about governance system and about the system itself. So something that according to our book, private bankers and private institutions really don't like is competition. What they exactly like, you have the American, I think, second edition. But what is most important is that, in the competition, they have the techniques of fighting with each other or absorbing each other, and they know how to control the market. They don't really know what to do when competition comes, for example, from a public institution that provides a competent, efficient, and very satisfying function as a competitor. And of course, there are economists will tell me, no, if you have a state bank competing with private banks, it's no longer a competition, it's a monopoly. Well, A, there are ways to regulate that, and B, really, I'm yet to see confident research that would convince me that a state bank cannot deliver something that a private bank does, or in fact that it cannot deliver it better. There are really long-term, expensive, not immediately short-term profitable projects that are of no interest to the private sector, but they're absolutely essential for the longevity and resilience of societies or economies. They are fundable only either with large part of public money or with public financial institutions, publicly owned financial and state-backed institutions. So that's kind of a weapon against sabotage. They don't like the state. Saboteurs sabotage the state. Hit it with them, or hit them with it. That's the political weapons every society has. And of course, there are questions of cronyism and nepotism, and on any issue of development, it comes up. Be that a crisis or an Asian miracle. The famous scandal of the World Bank report in 1993 and 1997 is the so-called Asian miracle report. The same cronyism was I think it was more than 100 pages of this Asian miracle report accounting for the success in 1993, and then it became crony capitalism in 1997.
Thanks, Anastasia. This is a very intriguing, intricate, multi-layer discussion. Please, friends, colleagues, Jerry, Nelson, and others, do you have further follow-up questions or discussion?
I have a question. I got in here late. I apologize. What's your opinion on central bank digital currencies and cryptocurrencies?
I'm yet to form that opinion.
Pardon me?
I'm yet to form that opinion. In some way, it continues my thought about moving into the industry as a state, as a state institution. It's the same argument about banking. And it's quite clever. And central banks have become very adept at kind of changing with the system. They're not to be dismissed in terms of how competent and how they've grown over the past even 10 decades in their thinking and what they can do. Kind of, in some ways, they saved the world back. It wasn't the governments who saved it, it was the central bank. At the same time, in terms of what they will do with digital currencies, how it will work, I don't have a firm answer to that question yet. It's good to claim this innovation, but you need to know what you're doing. And unfortunately, in my experience, private industry is always ahead of the system. So as central banks are devising regulations, there are now several layers of dark web where cryptocurrencies are being used for child trafficking, human organ trade, and of course, narco traffic. So are they going to do? What are they going to do with digital currency?
Nelson, please.
I want you to just reiterate a point you made. See if I got this clearly. Can you hear me? You can hear me, right? You mentioned financial innovation, and in the 90s, well before and after, many derivatives and all sorts of innovations were taking place. And is your argument? Let me just say it. So, is your argument that this is all a way of staying one step ahead of regulators? Innovation has no intrinsic useful purpose, but it's a way of staying ahead and of avoiding regulation and being basically that's the motive for innovation. Am I being too crude here, or how would you put it?
A small correction, not one step ahead. Hopefully, more than 5. It depends on how rich you are and which lawyers you can afford, but possibly 10. So yes, ahead of the regulators. And I didn't say that I don't see intrinsic value to innovation at all. In fact, I tried to say that I value innovation. I like to have my I don't use derivatives in daily life, but it's nice to have a financialized system where things work, deliver, and where I can use, mobile banking or transfer money with a click of my phone. And these are quite primitive financial innovations, but there are useful and hopefully productive uses to that. But it only works just as Minsky's taxonomy. Ponzi finance, a Ponzi pyramid, also delivers nicely as long as you are the first to get out. So sabotage cycle, it also delivers some value. The innovation does deliver until a particular point. And you need to have a very well-equipped regulatory apparatus to understand where is the point is for which instrument or technique. And a political observation is that American regulators have tended to be much more well-equipped and prepared and professional in understanding where that line is than, for example, Europeans or UK or British. The other financial systems, nobody is really scared of their regulations, but everybody's scared of new designs of SEC or the Fed or any other body, or God forbid, a Senate investigation on something.
Okay. Yeah.
In some way, it's the nice flip side of the proximity between Wall Street and power, between having those Goldman people very nearby to regulatory circles.
One of the arguments in the 90s for the rise of derivatives of all sorts was this was a way of taking advantage of the asset bubbles that were growing, and there were some that you could get higher returns, sort of monetize the assets. That was part of I think that was the banking rationale for that. I mean, I mean, it's a rationale, but
yeah, well, the trick is that, of course, derivatives, they will tell you there is an asset underneath that is being monetized.
Yeah.
The derivative or the product is the asset. Often there is nothing there. It's just a relationship with contractual parties at best. So no, that's the traditional explanation, but I don't like it. What I do like, and I'm not against derivatives as a class, they have very useful, again, uses and functions. What happened in the 90s is that markets have opened. The world has become, I'm not saying one, but the world has become more interconnected, more complex, and with all those new things that you could now do, for example, in Eastern Europe and Asia, with more things to be done there, there are more contracts, more risks, and more financial service infrastructure to address them. It's no longer a simple, plain vanilla American contract between two domestic firms. You're now expanding your supply chain. You're selling something to Eastern Europe. And all of them, one operation can have 50 contracts servicing it. It could be something to do with finance, with oil, with delivery of trucks, or it's even in the real productive economy. One simple idea can generate 50 financializable, insurable activities, and none of them. It could be that some of them were criminal, but it's possible that I'm very prudent with my money. I'm a banker, and I will go and say, please sell me an insurance or a derivative product, because I'm actually not sure what will happen in the Kremlin with the price of oil or wheat or oranges, and I need some protection, because my business is not just for only 1 year. My business is for hopefully, longer.
I'm just going to intervene here, if you don't mind. I have another meeting to get to. So I just wanted to say thank you again, Anastasia, and best regards to Ronan.
He's next to me. He sees you.
Yeah, there you are.
Thank you very much. Nice.
Sorry, I have to leave.
Please, everyone, and Anastasia and Ronan, this is very crucial of cardinal importance, under discussed. So we are enormously grateful for this contribution, and this discussion is open-ended in a profound way. It's open-ended not just as a, but it is structurally open-ended, and it's a perplexity, a conundrum that we all face and are a part of. Anastasia, Ronan, everyone taking part, thanks very much. Time-wise, this is a good place to end, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this. I hope
thanks very much. Thanks everybody. Au revoir.
Have a lovely day.
So before, just on a closing note, next week we're going to be hosting Vibod Prasarati, who is going to be talking about platform capitalism in India. So.
Merci.
See you next week. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Anastasia. Good to see you. Thank you. Greetings to Ronan.